Cooper, a barrel maker, and a fifth monarchist, that is, a Puritan who wanted to usher in the reign of King Jesus, named Thomas Venner, tried to raise a rebellion in London, but only about 50 people showed up. Puritan preachers said that England and that sin city, London, were ripe for God's punishment. It came in 1665. Sometime after Christmas in 1664, Dr. Nathaniel Hodges was, quote, called to a young man in a fever who had 2 risings about the bigness of a nutmeg broke out, one on each thigh. The young man survived, but he was the first harbinger of London's last and most notorious outbreak of plague. The spring of 1665 was unusually warm, and parish clerks and the compilers of the Bills of Mortality, a weekly list of deaths, began to notice that they were recording more burials, and that most of those were from plague. The parish of St. Giles in the Fields reported, the week ending 30th of May, 9 plague deaths. 6th of June, 31 plague deaths. 18th of June, 68. 20th of June, 101. And the week ending the 27th of June, 143 people had died of the plague. You'll note the element of modernity here. London had been compiling the Bills of Mortality ever since a previous outbreak in 1592. But Pepys also noted that such statistics were not always to be trusted. Parish clerks wanted to avoid panic, and so they underreported. Sometimes they missed the poor entirely. Puritan dissenters lived and died outside the parish structures, so they wouldn't be reported either. The diarist really knew that something was amiss by early June. This day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and "Lord have mercy upon us" writ there, which was a sad sight to me, being the first of that kind that to my remembrance I ever saw. It put me into an ill conception of myself and my smell, so that I was forced to buy some rolled tobacco to smell and to chew, which took away the apprehension. What was Pepys so afraid of? It's generally agreed, though not without dissent, that from 1347 through the 1720s, Western Europe was subjected to repeated visitations of the same disease. Though medieval Europeans called it the Black Death, not the Black Plague as careless students sometimes do today, by the 17th century they referred to it simply as the plague. What was the plague? There are 2 types, bubonic and pneumonic, both enterobacteria. Pneumonic plague is less common and tends to be passed through the air. Bubonic plague ensues from the bite of a flea carried on the European black rat, Rattus rattus, which traveled in carts engaged in trade. Contemporary Europeans did not understand this pathology. If breathed upon or bitten, symptoms appear within 3 to 7 days. They include fever, diarrhea, headaches, a swelling of the armpits and groin, infected lymph nodes, and rampaging internal bleeding, leading to black blotches on the skin, hence the term Black Death. There was little people could do. Popular remedies included rosemary, cakes of arsenic under the armpits, charms and amulets, the maintaining of open fires to burn the plague out of the air. One Dr. Hodges, who stayed at his post through the plague epidemic, quote, drank sack, that's Spanish white wine, to dissipate any lodgment of the infection. Probably about as good a method as any. Despite these measures, the death rate would range anywhere from 30 to 70%. One of the most frightening aspects of the disease was its suddenness. One could be fine 1 minute, dying the next. Thus, Pepys's coachman, June 17, 1665. It struck me very deep this afternoon, going with a hackney coach from my Lord Treasurer's down Holborn. The coachman I found to drive easily and easily, at last stood still, and come down hardly able to stand, and told me he was suddenly struck very sick and almost blind, he could not see. So I light and went into another coach with a sad heart for the poor man, and trouble for myself, lest he should have been struck with the plague, being at that end of the town that I took him up. But God have mercy upon us all. In fact, parish officials and Londoners generally were no strangers to the plague. London's first visitation came in 664. There was another round in 1258, and then the infamous Black Death of 1348-49. Here are some numbers. In 1348-49, something like 15,000 people died out of a total population of maybe 45,000. That's 33% of the population of London. Plague returned in 1361-62, and there were 11 outbreaks between 1407 and 1479. In 1563, 17,404 died, 24% of a population of 85,000. In 1593, 10,675, 14% out of maybe 125,000. In 1603, 23,045, or 23% out of 141,000. James I had to postpone his coronation. In 1625, another coronation year, more bad luck for the Stuarts. 26,350 people die out of a little over 200,000, so that's about 20%. In 1665, we know of at least 55,797 deaths out of 459,000, about 17.6% of the population. But some contemporary estimates of the death toll, which go through 1666, put it at between 70 and 100,000 people. So when was the Great Plague? In absolute terms, 1665. But proportionally, 1348-49 killed more people than 1563, 1603, and 1625. In each of these latter cases, London lost 1/5 to 1/4 of its population. Let's stop and think about that for a moment. On average, every 40 years or so, early modern London saw 1/4 of its population simply wiped out. The worst months were in summer. In contrast to modern urban dwellers, who tend to dread winter, early modern people hated summer because disease seemed to thrive in the warmer months. By July 1665, 1,000 were dying per week. In the third week of September, the bills of mortality report 8,297 deaths. The French ambassador thought this was an underestimate, and the real figure was 14,000. So, what effect did this have on London and Londoners? Demographically, in the long term, the demographic effects were few in the sense that London replenished itself rapidly. But the short term was devastating. Pepys faithfully records the rising death toll over the summer, but more poignant are his personal losses. 31 July, Proctor, the vintner of the Mitre in Wood Street, and his son is dead this morning there of the plague. 8th of August, and poor Will that used to sell us ale at the hall door, his wife and 3 children dead. All, I think, in a day. By mid-August, the city streets were deserted, and London began to take on the atmosphere of one of those deserted cities in a science fiction epic. 16th of August. Lord, how sad a sight it is to see the streets empty of people, and very few upon the change, jealous of every door that one sees shut up, lest it should be the plague, and about us, 2 shops in 3, if not more, generally shut up. As this implies, economic London grounded to a halt. Shopkeepers fled or went bankrupt. People avoided taverns, theaters, and large gatherings. 22nd July, Pepys records, I to Foxhall, where, to the Spring Garden, but I do not see one guest there, the town being so empty of anybody to come thither. Long-distance trade became impossible because nobody wanted anything that came from London. Politically, Charles II and his court fled, first to Windsor and then to Oxford. Now this is what rich people did. When there was plague in town, you left. But it was seen as cowardly. Following tradition, the Lord Mayor and the aldermen stayed on the job. They always did this during the plague epidemic, and they issued orders. First, to clear the streets of dogs and cats. This is actually a bad idea, given that the cats might actually be the best defense against the rats. Second, expel vagrants. Another bad idea, and that it only spread the plague around. Vagrants would leave town and spread the plague. Third, they stopped ships in the Thames from ports where the plague was reported. Fourth, they prohibited attendance at funerals, but this was very hard to enforce. Fifth, they restricted attendance at inns and alehouses, which was happening anyway. Sixth, they banned ballad singers and hawkers. Seventh, they closed schools. And 8, they imposed a quarantine on the sick. Now this was city policy from 1581. Whenever plague broke out, each parish was supposed to nominate 2 discreet matrons, quote, to be paid searchers to inquire in parishes and neighborhoods as to who was sick. Infected houses were marked with a red cross. Inhabitants were quarantined for 40 days. These measures were seen as a death sentence for the whole household. Think about it, being locked up with plague victims for 40 days. In fact, The quarantined often refused to stay put and die, so the city posted guards with halberds at infected houses. By late summer 1665, people actually began to attack their guards and throw themselves from upper stories into the streets. Some would run into the streets naked and delirious, foaming at the mouth. One physician reported seeing others crying and roaring at their windows. As this implies, community broke down. Masters turned out apprentices, physicians abandoned patients, pastors abandoned flocks. But note that class still mattered. 22nd of August, 1665. After dinner, I by water to Greenwich, where much ado to be suffered to come into town for fear I should come from London, till I told them who I was. Servants, abandoned by their masters, were enlisted to drive the notorious dead carts, calling on the inhabitants of London to bring out your dead. They would then carry the bodies out to mass graves or plague pits just beyond the city walls. By the way, there's a legend, I can't verify this, that whenever you're on the tube and it diverts one way and then comes back for no apparent reason, that's supposed to be a plague burial ground. By late summer, the cart drivers and grave diggers began to be infected themselves. Quote, some died in the reins of their carts, which, stacked with corpses, moved on aimlessly at the whim of the horses. Because of the sheer volume of corpses, bodies were stacked nearly up to the surface, then covered over with a few inches of dirt and quicklime by endless shifts of grave diggers, who worked round the clock, often drunk, to get through their work. As this implies, the greatest effect of the plague epidemics may have been psychological. Naturally, the first reaction to the plague was fear and uncertainty, hence Pepys's worry about his smell above. Then grief, 29th October 1665. But in the street did overtake and almost run upon two women, crying and carrying a man's coffin between them. I suppose the husband of one of them, which methinks is a sad thing. Then there was obsession, 3rd September 1665. But Lord, how empty the streets are, and melancholy, so many poor people, and in the streets, full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walked. Everybody talking of this dead, and that man sick, and so many in this place, and so many in that. Some reactions might strike us as perverse, but are all too familiar from modern disasters. There were wild rumors of people infecting each other deliberately, that they would, quote, breathe in the faces out of their windows of well people going by. So there's a kind of demonization of the victims, right? They're actually spreading it. There was disorientation, 4th November, 1665. But now, how few people I see, and those walking like people that had taken leave of the world. And perhaps, finally, resignation. Thence to the office, and after writing letters, home to draw over anew my will, which I had bound myself by oath to dispatch by tomorrow night, the town growing so unhealthy that a man cannot depend upon living 2 days to an end. Years later, Daniel Defoe, who was a small boy during the 1665 epidemic, would capture all this in one of the greatest psychological novels in the English language, Journal of the Plague Year. I urge you to buy a copy and read it. Londoners did not get a reprieve until spring. Still, Pepys could write in January of 1666 that the city was coming back. And a delightful thing it is to see the town so full of people again as it now is, and shops begin to open, though in many places 7 or 8 together, and more all shut. But yet the town is full compared with what it used to be. I mean the city end, for Covent Garden and Westminster are yet empty of people, no court nor gentry being there. The court hadn't come back. Why did the plague go away? Nobody knows. Contemporaries thought that next year's Great Fire burnt it out somehow. That, of course, is nonsense. The brown rat, Rattus norvegus, did drive out the black rat, Rattus rattus, but not until the 18th century. Maybe the rats themselves acquired immunity. In any case, 1665 was the last major plague epidemic in England, but London's anti-horribility continued. The summer of 1666 was hot and dry. Most people were grateful because they thought that that would kill off the plague. Once again, the Great Fire, which began on the 2nd of September, was nothing unusual. London was continually burning. There had been fires in 60, in 675, which destroyed the first St. Paul's Cathedral, in 1087, which destroyed the third St. Paul's Cathedral. A series of fires, 1132 to 35, which destroyed lots of property from London Bridge north to, you guessed it, St. Paul's Cathedral. In 1212, a fire in Southwark destroyed St. Mary's Church and houses on London Bridge. There was another major fire in 1632. So why did London burn so readily? Daniel Defoe recalled the old London of his childhood. The streets were not only narrow, and the houses all built of timber, lath, and plaster, or as they were very properly called, paperwork, but the manner of the building in those days, one story projecting out beyond another, was such that in some narrow streets the houses almost touched one another at the top, and it has been known that men in case of fire have escaped on the tops of the houses by leaping from one side of a street to another. This made it often, and almost always happen, that if a house was on fire, the opposite house was in more danger to be fired by it, according to as the wind stood, than the houses next adjoining on either side. So that, quote, the buildings looked as if they had been formed to make one general bonfire, whenever any wicked party of incendiaries should think fit. Now don't forget, too, that lots of early modern London industry uses open flame. Think of smithies and bake shops. Indeed, all cooking takes place over open flame. Also, there was lots of tar and combustibles down by the docks. The whole thing is ready to go out. The Great Fire began on the morning of the 2nd September, just after midnight, in the house and bakery of Thomas Fariner, the King's baker, in Pudding Lane, just north of the river. He probably failed to damp the fire properly. The family escaped by climbing through an upstairs window into the next house, all but one frightened maid who refused to make the leap and was burned, the fire's first casualty. Neighbors tried to fight the fire, but Londoners had few tools with which to do so. Buckets, if a fountain was nearby, ladders to rescue those on upper floors, and staves with which to pull houses down to form fire breaks. Unfortunately, London's dryness and high winds overwhelmed their efforts. Now, in contrast to the plague, local government did not distinguish itself. About 1 a.m., the parish constables arrived, and they suggested pulling down houses as a fire break. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was then awakened and brought to the scene and told the same thing, but Bloodworth was reluctant. The area was full of rich mercantile property, so he went back to bed, exclaiming with impeccable